And hello, everyone. This is Discovering Autism, and I have a guest. His name is Todd Allen, and our topic today is going to be just how autism has affected different types of employment for Todd. And I suppose I could even add a few things in myself in retrospect to what my life has been. But so, Todd, hello, and tell us about yourself.
So, as you said, my name is Todd Allen. I'm 39 years old. I live in Littleton, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. And as you said, I'll be discussing the effects of that being autistic has had on the different types of employment that I've done in my life. There's been somewhat of a variety.
That's probably true to a lot of us. I don't know that for sure.
That's true.
As far as being different places we've been employed. Oh, that's another whole story. So, well, that's cool. Let's see. We have a general cheat sheet here that we're going by, so let me think here. So let's start off, I guess, with just how has autism affected your different jobs?
Well, I think so. I started out when I was about 16 in about what you'd expect, restaurant-type employment, fast food, that type of thing.
Yep.
I had learned by that age to a certain degree how to mask different aspects of it, I suppose you'd call it. Essentially learn things that you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. A lot of them still didn't make a great deal of sense to me. A lot of them still don't.
Yeah.
But I would still nonetheless learn not to do them.
Right.
I did still sometimes have issues with being a little too blunt for some people's tastes.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly if I thought something was incorrect or just didn't like it, I didn't tend to refrain from saying so.
Mm-hmm.
Which I also learned that sometimes you're not supposed to do.
Did you know at this point that you were autistic?
Yes, I did. I was
Okay.
diagnosed at about 15 years old, 14 or 15. I can't remember exactly.
Okay. What year would that have been? I'm just trying to put that in perspective. That's fine.
That would have been around 1993.
93. Yeah. See, I was diagnosed with ADD and everything back in like 1970, which was like they were still cavemen, I think, and dinosaurs. And so autism was on the was on the scope, but it was just a really small blip. And I don't hear a lot of people in which maybe the Asperger. That's hard to define, but it seems like there's fewer people that I have met that have been in my age group that have been defined early on. So I think times have changed. So I'm glad you found out. It'd be interesting to sort of compare our notes as far as how that's affected employment, because I was blind to it all. I mean, I look back and I go, geez, if I had known, I might have said, give it a little more time, or do this or do that. But I just kind of went with whatever the mood was of the day, which was a real mistake. So.
Yes, and I think knowing did help. Certainly throughout my time in school, it was more just a case of finding out where the walls were by banging into them. And with no idea why I seemed so different. Once there was some kind of explanation for it, and I at least had that starting point, I did find that to be easier to learn. Now I had it, and certainly at that time, even then, the doctor who diagnosed me told me that it was a relatively uncommon diagnosis at that time. And I had been to several others who diagnosed me with a series of other things, but what they said didn't work, and what they tried to do about it didn't seem to have any effect. The autism diagnosis was actually helpful.
Yeah. Did you feel that, I mean, I mean, how am I going to put this? Back, because I was about 10. No, I was around 11 or 12 when I was diagnosed. And at that point, I really was sort of like, I didn't have any say in it. I didn't really even fathom, I couldn't really understand what it was. And so if somebody had said, of course, if I'm putting myself in your shoes, if I was that age when I was diagnosed at your age, if I was diagnosed at your age, your time, I don't know that I would have had I don't know if I could have said, I don't think this is a correct diagnosis. I think I'm something else. I did that later. And when I was sort of like going, something's going on here, something's wrong. And I'd go to the doctors and they'd say, well, yeah, it's depression, it's this, it's that. And it's like, no, but I could never define it. So I think it's great that you finally got to a doctor that did that. I wish I had been at some point in my life around a doctor that would have said, let's look into something else here.
Well, I think it also helped that that particular doctor was one who I got along very well with. He was actually in quantum physics research before he went into psychiatry.
Wow.
So we could talk about things like that. And so I got along with him a good deal better than I did any of the other doctors that I had been to, and was able to kind of connect with him that way. And he would just kind of, a lot of what I did with him is he would just kind of go through things that had happened with me, and I didn't understand why they had the result they had, and he would just kind of help me understand what might have been at issue there that I didn't know.
Nice. That's a blessing. Yep.
Yeah, it helped me a great deal.
Yeah. So I can say, like you said, a lot of us started off working the fast foods or whatever. And so by that time you were diagnosed, and what was your concept of careers then? I mean, do you feel you said, okay, I want to be this when I grow up, or I still don't feel like I know? Part of that may be late diagnosis, but part of that may just be the autism. I don't know. But did you have a sense of like, I want to do this?
At that point, I don't think that I had a very defined sense of that. Certainly a lot of the case at that time is just that, I wanted to be able to drive. And if I was going to do that, I had to be able to pay the insurance increase for that.
Gotcha.
So, I just needed to be able to make some money essentially. And even before that, it was certainly not a problem to work. I actually, before that, had done some of the basic lawn mowing and babysitting and that type of thing around the neighborhood.
Yeah.
There was actually one kid in the neighborhood who was known for being an absolute terror to babysitters, and who I actually got along very well with.
Cool.
So I was over to his relatively frequently. I suspect now that he was probably autistic as well.
Oh, really?
But,
yeah.
I taught him how to play Magic the Gathering, which he picked up very quickly. I'd just bring my cards over. We'd sit there and do that all night and, feed him, send him off to bed.
Yeah, cool. Wow. That's another whole topic, is how our community can help support the younger people in our community and the parents of the younger people in our community. I think there's a place for that. So that's a great story. Of you helping that one child.
Yeah, I never had any real issues with him.
Yeah.
So yeah, but no. Back to your original question. I was certainly interested in several different things. Certainly in space travel, which was something that I was interested in. But I also knew that the odds of getting into that field were not particularly high.
Yeah.
And I had actually considered actually going along those lines, but when I, one normal route into that is through the Air Force, but when I tried to look into doing that, my eyesight was too poor and they didn't want me. So,
Bummer. Well, but then it led you to...
So after that, I had moved up to Washington State with my now ex, and had started going to school there as well. I found myself being quite interested in chemistry, but I had also, since a very young age, been interested in computers, and this again being back in the early 90s when most people didn't even have a computer at home.
Right.
And didn't understand why anyone would want one.
Mm-hmm.
So, my uncle worked at Radio Shack at the time and got me an old Tandy system that they were going to get rid of. And of course, at that time, it came with the big 400-page manual on how to use it and program it, because you couldn't just go look that stuff up.
Yeah.
So, I used that and learned some basics about how to program it. I, certainly wasn't a wizard at it at that time, but I enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as it turned out some years down the road, there was actually a quickly developing market for people who could program computers.
Right.
So when I was working at Dish Network, initially doing technical support, I actually saw an opening for people who would be programming an application, view their team's performance and things like that, and applied for it and actually ended up getting it.
Cool. And what year is this, just to put it in a perspective? You said 90s?
That would have been around 2006, 2007.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So yeah, before that I had done some, I had worked for quite a long time for a place that did automotive and commercial electrical service, as well as, different specialty batteries for different applications. A lot of what I did there was driving, since they, for whatever reason, didn't have too many people there who could drive a manual transmission.
Okay.
So when we needed to use the pickup to take something out, that was a manual, and I usually ended up driving it. But also I was often responsible for figuring out different things like the procedures for returns of defective items, because we had a pretty wide range of suppliers. And of course, every one of them did it somewhat differently. So I would quite often get assigned to stuff like that, because I could very quickly look at their system and figure it out. And even at that time, I was also kind of the unofficial IT support for everyone there, because I could probably get the computer working again.
Right. Yeah. And at this point, have you disclosed your autism to anyone? Has it been a problem yet for you in any way, or a benefit? Well, the benefit we sort of talk about, because sort of your special interests in computers and stuff. But was there ever a problem the autism was causing at this point?
I'm not. Looking back, I think it was. I'm not sure that I recognized it as such, but I still did have that, some
executive control, executive function, where.
Sorry?
Oh, it's what I guess what they call that executive function, where you sort of say what you think instead of think about what you're going to say. That issue you were talking.
That's a great way of putting it, and yes, it's exactly that.
Yeah. I think I'm still guilty of that, or guilty. I guess that's.
Oh, I know I am. Certainly, my wife would tell you I am.
Isn't that funny? I mean, it's just you said your wife you think is on the spectrum, right?
I think it's possible.
Okay.
If so, it's never been diagnosed or anything like that, but certainly she has the same type writing as I ever had in computers. She tends to be very much introverted, very much like I am, and certainly she has at times quite possibly said something before thinking much about it as well. So it's certainly a possibility.
Gotcha. Okay, so we're going from then helping with being sort of Mr. IT at the actually we've jumped to where you were helping with programming. What was that job?
So, I had actually started out first at a satellite TV company, doing technical support for, essentially helping people if something got off kilter with the equipment they had set up. I would either help them fix it over the phone, or if it was something that was beyond doing that way, then we would set up a technician to go out and look at it on site. And it was something I was quite good at, as you might imagine. I understood the systems well, and I generally could relatively quickly diagnose the problem. So I was quite often the top scorer there, or very near it, and got different bonuses for that.
Cool.
And then saw an internal position set up where they wanted people who knew how to program to help them do some software for the supervisors there to understand better what was going on. And I know now that the software they were using for that previously was an absolute mess, and almost nothing in it was accurate. So there's a very good reason that they wanted to do that.
Yeah.
So I applied for that. And actually the guy who I applied with and was my team lead is still a very good friend of mine now. I was quite certain that I had absolutely bombed the test he gave me because it covered such a huge variety of things that there's no conceivable way that anyone would know them all. When I asked him about that later, he said, well, it was designed that way. I have 4 spots. If I have 40 people apply and 10 people get a perfect score, how does that help me? So it was designed so that nobody could ever actually pass it. I want to see how you think.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
Which I thought was rather an ingenious way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
So I worked on that team for a few years, and that was an absolutely, I loved doing that project, and it was an absolutely perfect fit for me because we literally designed this thing from the first setup of the database on up.
Cool.
Just completely our own project, and it was one of the things that I've most enjoyed doing at work altogether, just because we had that type of control over it, and we were able to really make it ours.
And that's an interest of yours too. I mean, all the above. It was just like the perfect storm of a career, or of an employment opportunity for you. So that's great. Okay, so you are here, and what the ideal job that you were creating this database, and how long did that job last?
Not just the database. We did the whole application from the ground up.
Okay.
All the way from the basic database to the end user.
Where did you get your programming skills at that point? Did you on the job, or did you self-study, or how did you do that?
Well, no, just self-taught. Now, actually, like I said, I had gotten interested in it very early on with my uncle and the computer that he gave me, and just continued to do some of that. And then there was a neighbor of ours who was an aerospace engineer and ran a bulletin board system. I don't know if you remember those.
Sure, yeah, I do.
So he gave me access to that, and through that I was able to get on to Usenet and talked to different people who were, of course, at that time, the majority of people on the internet were either professors or students or some type of engineer or scientist, and that certainly included people who did programming.
Cool.
And certainly that interested me because apparently they thought I was a graduate student. I didn't lie to them about it, but I didn't correct them either.
Yeah.
So, I didn't, if they knew I was a 17-year-old kid in high school, I didn't know if they'd talk to me or not. So
Yeah, I hear you. What did your parents have an influence in this? Were they very techie, or were they?
They did. Certainly, when I would develop interests like that, like my interest in space travel, they certainly did everything to encourage that. They,
Right.
Would get me different magazines about it. If they saw something interesting about it, they'd make sure to let me know. So it was certainly something they encouraged.
Sure.
I don't think they really as much understood the programming bit, and I think they essentially just thought I was playing games. So I don't think in that case they really understood what it was that I was doing.
I can just see.
I think they viewed the computer as the same as the Nintendo, and it was just a different system.
Yeah, I can see the Gate family going, "Bill, get out of that garage." You've got.
And there certainly was some of that, and I'll get to that a bit later. But yes, but then after once the internet and the web kind of started to take off, I also are you familiar with MUDs at all?
Say it again, though. What is it called?
MUDs, multi-user dungeons.
No.
So essentially, today's MMO type games, but they were entirely text-based.
I remember text games. Yes, I do remember that type of game. They were fun, actually.
Right. Yeah, but it wasn't Zork or something like that was single player. It was multiplayer.
Okay.
So you would, be on at that time it was a telnet server with a bunch of different people, and you would just have text going by telling you whatever other people were saying or doing or whatever have you. And so I played one of those for a while that was based on Star Wars. And then once they figured out that I knew how to program, at that point using the term rather loosely, I knew some things about it, but they asked me if I would be willing to help with writing code for the game, because of course we were always trying to add new stuff to it or do whatever we could. So I said that I would, and I learned a lot of what I know actually from doing that, as far as learning how to work on programs that other people are also working on, how to make sure that you communicate with them and don't accidentally step on each other's toes or mess up something they're doing.
Yeah.
So that was definitely a substantial learning experience, and I learned a great deal of it from that. Of course, I also learned the C language, and then eventually C++. And since the programming at Dish Network that I was doing was in primarily C#, C and C++ were one of the major bases for the C# language. So I was able to pick that up very quickly with knowing those as a baseline.
Wow.
Now, as far as learning to use a database, I had not done that. The data storage on the MUD was just flat files. So as far as using a database, yes, that was all picked up on the fly.
Wow. That's it. I see. When you've talked about some of your interests, I had parallel interests in it. It's like I was terrible in. One of the reasons I was diagnosed as a kid at the age of like 12 was of the problems I was having in school, and it was dyslexia, ADD, and some other stuff, and so it was hard for me to. I think the dyslexia had more of an effect on me now looking back than I really realized, but I eventually kind of got my act together. I mean, I was probably like a DC student up through 6th, 7th grade, and started to pull it together for junior high and everything. And I was surprised. I look back, and my parents never really encouraged me in this. I don't really understand why, but I was the top of the class in chemistry. It was something I enjoyed, and but I never did anything with it after that. And
you and me both. Actually, I'm currently going to school for organic chemistry.
Really?
Just because of the fact that while I like programming, and I always will, but I've gotten more than a bit sick of the tech industry.
Really? Yeah. And how's we'll have to move on then to chemistry. Where does that fit since you have been a programmer? Are you still programming?
Oh, I still program. I always will.
Okay.
Even if it's just working on my own projects, it's not the programming of it that I don't like. I love doing that.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Go into a scientific or technical field is that my knowledge of that will still be useful there.
Right.
Certainly there is a need for being able to interpret and process data in that type of field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that will still be of use. It's just that anymore there's, jobs in tech are very often unstable anymore. A place will merge or go on to something else and suddenly you're laid off. I'm doing some freelance work with it right now, and that's fine, but it's of course always up and down.
Yeah. Yep. That's a shame. I mean, the whole world as far as employment has been under change the last 10 years or so. Lots of I don't know. We were talking about this earlier with at work, and that is that there's no loyalty. Companies are not loyal to their employees and vice versa. It used to be where, at least it was at one point, where you stayed with the company for life. Like IBM, people that stayed there for life, and that was encouraged, and it was a good relationship with business and employer, but employee. But now
there's that, and I think the other piece that we're going to see relatively soon is that, with the increasing use of automation and computerization, if you even look at it now, I can run a single database query that I can write in 5 minutes or less. That, 30 years ago, if you wanted that kind of data, it would have taken you a team of file clerks and accountants and a month.
Yeah.
So I think what we're starting to see the effects of, and are probably going to much more see the effects of over the next decade, is that there just aren't going to be as many jobs available as there are working age adults.
Yeah. Yep. What's the? There's a term called singularity that where there's a merging of men and machines, or people and machines, and you probably know Ray Kurzweil, or the name.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm familiar with Kurzweil and the singularity theory. I don't foresee anytime soon. Just if for no other reason than that true artificial intelligence has been 10 years away for about 70 years now.
Good point. Yeah. I mean, it's a dream that they think is coming, but when they get to the reality of it, it's so much more complicated. That's actually a good thing. That's what we don't need. I mean, I don't know. From what little I've read about it is, it's let's keep the two separate.
I don't think technology has to be bad. It depends on how we address it. Even as far as automation, if it turns out, I mean, why should we have people doing boring and dangerous jobs when we can have robots do them?
True.
But we still have to address the fact that will mean a shift in how we approach things.
Mm-hmm. and also what I mean, it's just sort of like what now dodgeball was considered a dangerous game for kids when that's what we used to play all the time as kids, and so it's also the definition of dangerous is going to be changing too, and I think there's some if you
certainly that, or even that I remember as a 6 or 7-year-old kid riding my bike over half a mile to school along a major road, and if that was just what you did, or if I wanted to walk up to the gas station and get a candy bar with my allowance, I did it.
Yeah. And no help.
Big deal about it.
And to add to the drama of you riding along the highway, it was probably without a helmet.
Oh yeah, I didn't have a helmet or anything like that. And certainly if you've ever seen some of the kids' car seats at that age, I mean, granted, my mother was a nurse, so she did try and get some of the ones that were at least the safer designs, but they're nothing like the actual 5-point restraint systems that you have today.
Yeah. Well, I remember riding in the back of the pickup truck down the highway, with my dad, with nothing to hold on to, it's just funny how and I'm not saying that this is not a good thing that we're not.
Or on the back of my uncle's motorcycle. Now I did have to wear a helmet for that, but
right. I know it's just
fine, get on, take a ride with them.
Yeah. You get into you get into the old cars and they don't even have seat belts, let alone airbags. But yeah, times have changed.
Well, that and there's been a whole bunch of technology toward that where, anymore it's car wrecks look a lot worse because there's a lot more damage to the car, but that's because they're specifically designed so that the car takes the impact rather than the driver.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I know. There's a whole science behind all that. But my brother-in-law worked for Daimler Chrysler for 35 years, and he would talk about a lot of what they did. He was actually an accountant, but he got to be around all the engineers and everything. He was there up in Michigan at their one plant, or the corporate office actually. But that's where they did all the. They had the small, call it the prototype factory was there, so they'd say, what about this? Let's build that. And they'd build it. It doesn't look good, or it doesn't work, or whatever. And so you get to talk with those guys. It was really interesting, some of his stories. Okay, so now, we're talking about 2006-ish that you were full-time employed then, working programming. Now that you're in
right. Now that was quite honestly, when I first started programming, I had quite honestly not even considered doing it as an actual job. I just enjoyed it and thought it was fun.
Cool.
But I certainly wasn't going to say no. So after the project at Dish Network, I went on to a place that did a tracking system for. Are you familiar with channel sales?
No.
So essentially, that's where the manufacturer of some product, instead of selling things directly, then they'll sell lots out to a distributor. The distributor breaks it up and sells it to a wholesaler. The wholesaler distributes it out, and it goes through that whole channel.
Uh-huh.
So at that time, there was a need to track that because there had actually been a pretty substantial issue with where some companies had done essentially a pump and dump scheme with their stock, where they massively oversold into their channel, immediately counted those as sales, which drove the price of the stock up, and then dumped the stock and crashed it, and also entirely flooded the distribution channel and caused the price to crash. So the Securities and Exchange Commission then made the rule that you could only count those as sales once they actually sold to the end user.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, then they needed a way to track that through. And as it turned out, knowing where that stuff was going and getting sold was useful data to them anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
We ran a setup that allowed them to track, how much inventory was still in their channel, who and where it was selling to, all that kind of stuff.
Uh-huh.
And that was the same thing again. I ran up and down entirely through the system. I might be anywhere from literally on the back end server that ran the entire Oracle database all the way up through the very front end production website. And I might be messing with anything along that whole system. I worked with all the systems that we used to intake that data, since we of course had to take in a huge volume of data from a very large number of different places. And also learned about what's called the electronic data interchange protocol, which is one that it's a text format to transmit a whole bunch of different types of data between large companies. I'd never even heard of it, and it rather interested me.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked for a few years, and then went on to a place that did tracking for short-term and long-term disability and federal and state mandated leaves for different large companies. Then for a while for a mortgage company doing their internal application software. And then, and as far as and at all those times, I still ran into those same issues that some of the people I worked with and some of the feedback that I often got was, you're rude or you're blunt or whatever the case may be. Because, if something, certainly one thing that I learned very early on is that if something is unclear, you'd better clarify it, because otherwise what you program may not be what they wanted.
Yeah.
So when I would get in those specifications, you'd take a fine-tooth comb to them. What do you mean by this? 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 What do you mean by this?
Uh-huh.
And so, and there were people who appreciated that. There were also people who really didn't.
I can't see how you could not do that. I mean, like you're saying, the possibility of error, of miscommunication would be that. I mean, you got to get. It's like carpentry. You measure twice, you cut once. And
well, there were a lot of people who kind of had the attitude that you should know what I mean by that.
Oh boy, yeah.
And no, I'm not going to try to outguess you.
Right. That's just another whole topic. Was just how that just is a natural. Let's see. That seems like everybody should think that way. This is a little bit of a tangent here, but just talking about the autism itself, was that the things that I thought were just the way everyone thought. Of course, I didn't know I was autistic, so I assumed since I was normal that everyone else did what normal people do, and since I was normal, they did what I did. And that's still a sort of a puzzle for me. There's nothing seems to be worse than miscommunication. So I think it's such a positive thing to be like what you're saying. It's just like, hey, I need to know exactly what you mean here. So anyway, but that's just one of those.
Well, that was one of the points that I always tried to make with it, is that, hey, I would rather clarify too much than too little.
Yeah. I mean, how can you clarify? Yeah, you definitely can clarify too little, but I don't think you can clarify too much. But you're right.
Well, I mean, there were certainly cases that, what I would guess they meant by it really was what they meant.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But even so, it didn't hurt to have it clarified.
Right. So that was, it just seems like that's been sort of the one trait of autism that you felt influenced work the most in your life, was just being straightforward and concrete and to the point, and not playing the game of of different people that, whether it's a power thing or whether it's their own insecurity or whatever, that you're not being sensitive to that. That's a different issue really than what the communication issue is. But do you think that's pretty much what you find has been the hardest thing that your autism has?
Well, very much so, and I think that's especially true in a more often is that I've found in more roles is that if you're in something more like the restaurant setting or doing that electrical work stuff or whatever, if someone's unhappy about something, they're going to make sure you know that,
mm-hmm.
and are not surprised if you do the same. So, but in that more office type role, some people seem not to want it that way or to really dance around things. And number one, I'm not going to pick that up. So,
yeah.
If you want something, don't sit there and drop hints. Tell me what it is.
Right.
And if there's something I want, I'm going to do it the same way. I'm not going to sit there and dance around it and hope you can figure it out. I'm going to tell you.
Right.
And that does not always seem to be a method that's particularly appreciated.
That's actually the issue recently that brought everything to a pinnacle, I guess, of where I said, okay, there's something wrong. It is something about me. It's something I'm not catching. It's because it was a communication issue at work, and so I know that it's still there. And it's one of those. Will probably be switching jobs here pretty soon, and it's going through my mind. And actually, this is going to be it's a job working with not programming but data entry. But it's there's I guess there's 3 or 4 other people that are autistic I know that are on the team, and so it's going to be very interesting. And so I'm asking myself questions like, okay, how much do I disclose and when? And what's interesting is the man who owns the company, his son works there and he's autistic, so I think it's probably already sort of known. I mean, so I sort of want to take advantage of that situation for my sake, so I can be as productive as I can be, and so people understand why maybe I may be doing things different, or like you're saying, I'm more direct or something else. But so I'm thinking about this as we're talking, and I've been thinking about this since this job became a possibility, and it's like, okay, what do I do now? This will be my first job my first job as an autistic person, in a sense. I know that sounds funny to say it's not true, but for me knowing, so I'm learning and thinking about what you're talking about as far as applying it to my next employment.
So, yeah, and I think now that's something that I've never actually said that as far as in an employment type context. It's not been something that I've just ever done. So,
no need.
Because realistically, any type of, obviously if you're in a wheelchair or what have you, there might be some specific accommodations you need to ask for. But, I don't know what you'd even ask for with that is, you can't really ask for people to change their communication style overnight. You could, but I don't think they would do it.
Well,
I don't think they even necessarily could do it.
Not so much to change them, but so they were aware of anything, and I'm not saying I'm going to do this, but I'm just, my idea was that if there's something that I guess I'm still so new at understanding even my own traits that I don't think I'm still aware of when I'm doing something that is either offensive or looks strange or it can be perceived in any other way. And it just sort of, at least in my thinking now, it's sort of like, okay, it's just easier to say, okay, it's clear the waters, this is it. If you see something, this is it, no big deal, blah, blah, blah. And, but just so you know, but, and maybe not, I don't know. But that's I think a dilemma a lot of people have. I see that on Quora and some of the other forums and things where people are saying, should I disclose that I'm at my employment, that this or that, you know, and that's always a question. I know it all depends on the situation at the time and all that. So that's where I'm at too. We'll see.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately that's not something I have the answer to.
Oh, I know.
I think certainly, at least in the United States and with the Americans with Disabilities Act, if you could think of some specific accommodation that you would need, it would probably be to your benefit, because then if they can reasonably provide it, they're required to do that. I've just never really been able to come up with anything to come to them and say, hey, here's the deal and this is what I'm going to need.
Right.
But I think if you're in a situation where there would be something like that you could make a concrete request and say, I need this accommodation, then by law they're going to have to work with that.
Yeah. As long as it's a reasonable. I mean, and that's where they get into the legal. It's like saying, well,
correct, and it has to be reasonable. But I think certainly some requests could be.
Mm-hmm. I agree, especially if if it's like sensory issues or something where they like to play loud music. I'm not saying what company would, but it may be something where it's like, I need to wear hearing protectors or what is it where you have the headphones that have the noise canceling on them, and where it's like, no, policy, you can't do that. Well, can you make an exception? This is why I wear these. Okay.
Oh, sure, it's something like that. Now, of course,
yeah.
Most developers wear headphones, so that's not anything new to most of the places that have done this.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly if that ever became an issue, now it again gets to the point of reasonableness. If you're, in something like a machine shop where you have to be able to hear what's going on around you, that may not be reasonable.
Right. Yep. It's all, as I say, it's all very dependent on the circumstances. Okay, so when did you start into chemistry, into school?
Actually, just earlier this year.
Okay.
It was, something that had always interested me. I was very fortunate to have had a really great chemistry teacher in high school who got me very interested in both chemistry and in certainly the sciences in general, just because of the way that she did things.
Nice.
Very much the type of idea that, when we're doing our labs, I don't care if you get the expected result. I care about if you can tell me how you got there and give some good rationale as to why you got there. I don't even care if you're right.
Yeah.
Process.
You're thinking. That's great. I'm just sort of looking at my notes here. So you say you never really disclosed anything. Did you ever talk with coworkers, or was that always something? And I'm not. You just kept it to yourself because there was no reason to disclose, correct?
For the most part. Now, certainly, like I said, at Dish Network, we became friends with several of those after some time. So, they know about it. Sure,
I hear you there. Yeah. Do you, just in your experience, if there's other people, and I know it's again, we're just, as we were saying, it's very dependent upon who you are, how your autism is being expressed, the employment situation, the people that you're working with, all those things are factors that determine what is best for you. But is there anything in general that you would say to people about being autistic and looking for or holding jobs, or it's just for the general audience?
I think more than anything, just to be aware that not everyone will share that same communication style that you're used to. And in fact, it might even be the case that most people don't. So you may have to deal with that. I wish I knew how to write the book on how to deal with it.
Yeah.
I don't. But if you're at least aware that that might be an issue, then it's something you can at least watch out for.
Yeah.
And also use your advantages to their maximum. Certainly a lot of people with autism are very good at understanding systems and different things like that, and a lot of your coworkers may not be. So if you can use that to your advantage, then by all means do.
That opens up an interesting topic because that would be a very good reason to disclose right away that you're autistic. If you could, if like I say, it was a tech job, and say, look, since the age of 2, I have been programming, if you could demonstrate either a knowledge or a skill that is sort of unique to autism, it might be a good reason to disclose.
I suppose it could be.
This is a thought.
That could work.
We're going to come up, I think, I hope this is maybe just ideal thinking, and I tend to be naive, but I think that we're coming up in a time when the autism is going to come out of the shadows, and that the positives contributions that people who are autistic make are going to make them in some ways sought after. And I think it is true now. I mean, you hear that Silicon Valley is, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard this. I don't know if you know of it, but if Silicon Valley has a high percentage of people who are on the spectrum. I suspect that's true, and I would certainly suspect that a substantially higher than normal proportion of programmers that I've worked with have been on the spectrum. Interesting. Yeah. And I've heard Bill Gates is actually on the spectrum. Do you know if that's confirmed?
I don't believe anyone knows that for certain. I know that some people have considered the possibility.
Uh-huh.
I've also heard it considered with Steve Jobs,
yeah.
with his extreme interest and his very blunt communication style. But again, I don't know of anything that would actually confirm that in either case. Right.
Well, I've heard like Thomas Edison was one other one, and I don't know. I can't. But there's just
Thomas Edison has been floated about. Alan Turing, certainly a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and I like I say, hopefully that will hopefully we'll come to sort of a new age here in autism where we can sort of step out of the shadows more. Well,
I think so now that it's recognized, and I think as far as people in the past, certainly Turing being rather reserved and private could have also been more a function of his being gay at a time when that was not something you wanted the world to know.
Mm-hmm.
So you just never know.
Right. Okay, well, one of the topics too, and maybe we can do this again in another program because we're already here pushing about 55 minutes, and would be you are married and you have you suspect that your wife is on the spectrum, but you have children or a child that is on the spectrum?
Again, possibly.
Okay.
She's and I've always been of the thought that with kids that little, if they're not, of the extreme or nonverbal type, it's a little bit young to be diagnosing that.
Okay, I didn't
given
know.
that she's only 4 years old.
Oh, okay.
And every kid develops differently. So I think it's something that would, and certainly no one would accuse Piper of being nonverbal.
Nice.
But, certainly as you go forward, I think it's a possibility. She has certainly developed, some of the really intense interests and things like that.
Uh-huh.
So I think it's a possibility, and she also does have that very straightforward and blunt communication style. She doesn't dance around anything.
You're talking about Piper now.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
So I certainly think it's a possibility, but I think it's too early to say.
Gotcha. Well, I know when you had said you wanted to also possibly talk about being an autistic parent, I thought maybe you also had an autistic child too. But that's something
And
that...
it's entirely possible.
Yeah. Well, there's one group that I was a member of that had a mother, father, and daughter who were on the spectrum. And it was interesting talking with them about the accommodations they made for each other, because some of them had some real sensory issues and space issues and just energy issues, and how they all kind of like, okay, I get it. Mom needs to go for now, or so-and-so needs to go for now, or back off, and it was just it would be a fascinating interview, but I'm thinking as a study in general too, just to be able to see the differences in how an all autistic family performs versus an all neurotypical.
I think even just with one, where I've had to kind of work with some of the things that I have that way, like you mentioned loud music earlier.
Uh-huh.
That's never been an issue for me, but actually having something like that very quiet or at the edge of hearing really bothers me.
Interesting.
So you might hear from me, turn that up or off. I don't care which.
Yeah. Well, that would be a fascinating program if you want to do that sometime.
Yeah, we could certainly look at doing that.
Okay, that'd be cool. Okay. Well, this has been Todd Allen, and he's talked to us about his experiences from an early age knowing he was autistic to now, and how it's affected his careers and the path that he's chosen. And thank you, Todd, for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Okay, and we'll talk with you all later. This is Autism. No, it actually is. It's not Autism Inside Out. This is Discovering Autism. So thank you, and we'll talk with you again soon. Bye-bye.